Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. First of all, I want to thank those that sat in for me the last couple of days. I've been in Mississippi and Alabama meeting some of our donors as well as our friends at American Family Radio. And so I want to thank Penna Dexter as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews for what they've done in this chair. I'm going to be here, of course, now for a while, and so we'll be getting into all sorts of issues. Let me give you a little bit of a sense of what's going to be taking place over the next couple of hours. This hour, we're really kind of having an open line. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about kind of the back and forth between the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. Also, the head of Black Entertainment Television has said, even though he's African-American, that Democrats have gone too far. And he seems to be supporting Donald Trump. And whether or not there will be other African-American voters that follow him, we will see. There's, of course, been this ongoing debate about the citizenship question in the census. It is not just inside the Beltway kind of discussion. It will determine whether or not you have to answer certain questions, and we'll get into that. Before the hour is up, I thought, our good friend Mark Davis has a piece, How to Screw Up a World Championship. I've tried to say very little about the women's soccer team, because after all, they did win. But it's Megan Rapinoe who's been saying some things and doing some things that cause a lot of people to say, okay, we appreciate your athletic ability. We don't really appreciate some of the things you've said and some of the things you've done. But we'll get into that as well. And then we'll get into some other issues. My commentary today is about woke fascism. There's also a good piece that I'm going to talk about by Dr. Merrill Matthews, who was, of course, in this chair yesterday. And when he was with us last Friday, the Friday before, talked about the fact that when you have the Democrats blaming corporations, I think there's a lot of Americans are going, excuse me, this corporation I work for, whether it's Amazon or whether it's Google, or these are really good places to work. I am not sure I hate them the way you hate them. And so we'll get into some of those conversations as well. Yesterday I had one on the issue of constitutional order. I want to come back to that because it's relevant to some of these topics. And I don't know if I should cover, I guess we'll probably cover it this hour. We have, of course, all sorts of things in the news, and it all has to do with Jeffrey Epstein and, of course, whether or not there was a sweetheart deal that was put together by the Secretary of Labor, Mr. Acosta, and, we'll get into some of that as well, Alex Acosta. So I guess we will have to get into that. Almost have to give a parental advisory, because when you're talking about a man who made a practice of going after underage girls, I don't even want to post the article by Michelle Malkin, although it reminds us that he's just one of many individuals who have been major donors to the Democrat Party. Nobody's hardly said anything about some of these individuals, but now in which you can find at least some possibility of linking it to Donald Trump. Oh, well, now we're going to talk about Jeffrey Epstein. These stories go back to 2006, 2007, and yet they're in the news, and of course we know why. There is an attack, of course, on the president and on his Secretary of Labor, who I think may have indeed provided a sweetheart deal, so I'm not denying that, but I am saying that some of the reason that all of a sudden people are paying attention to this is because even though Jeffrey Epstein has been connected mostly to Bill Clinton, I understand he's still dating these days, then that was something that was sort of ignored by the mainstream press. But now that they can find some possible connection to Donald Trump, it's in the news. And it's kind of interesting because I was at a meeting yesterday where some people said, well, isn't it fortunate that Donald Trump kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago? That sometimes gets missed in terms of some of the conversation, but that is true because he was concerned. That is, Donald Trump, a former candidate, before he was even a candidate, before he's even talking about the presidency, kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago because of what he was doing. So trying to find a connection is hard to find, but the mainstream press, if you've listened to any of the various mashups that have been put together, various clips from various shows, so often they want to put the word Trump and Epstein together. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's real quickly, just before we take our first break, get into this ongoing debate between the Speaker of the House and one member of Congress. Now, in the old days, and I guess I count myself as one of the older guys around the table, even when we do a millennial roundtable, I really am the old guy, but even on other days, I've been around for a while. You can't imagine this happening with previous speakers of the House. Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House when Ronald Reagan was president, or Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House when Bill Clinton was president, or even John Boehner, who for a while was the Speaker of the House when George W. Bush was president. These are individuals that wielded tremendous power, and as a result, if you were a first-year freshman member of Congress, you were sitting on the back bench. You were a backbencher. What has changed is twofold. Number one, social media, which allows individuals to have a much greater influence than they would normally have, and then a willing press to actually accentuate that. Because if all these tweets and comments by AOC were simply in Twitter, I don't know that it'd get very far, but it's because then they get maximized in terms of the news cycle. And the kind of counterpoint makes it even more enticing. So as a result, we have now Nancy Pelosi saying today that she was done talking in the public about Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And the reason she felt that she had to bring even that up is because there has been a back and forth, not just between her in AOC and the squad, as they're getting to be known now, the other women who are the case. But there were people that were so-called blue dog Democrats that have been critical as well. And so when we come back from the break, I'm going to try to get into this a little bit more. The blue dog Democrats, and there are very few of them now, is those individuals that tend to be a little bit more conservative Democrats who, as you might imagine, are very concerned about the direction in which the Congress is going, and in particular, the direction in which the Democrat Party is going, because these very radical statements made by many of these freshman members, as well as some that are now running for the presidency, don't really do very well in what typically is a district that is difficult for a Democrat to win. And so, the yellow dog Democrat was the old idea that people in this district was so safe that they would even vote for a yellow dog if it had the name Democrat next to it. If it had a D next to its name, they'd vote. And by the way, there have been some examples of dogs or other creatures that have actually been elected in some of these joke primaries. But nevertheless, the blue dog was the idea that, we are in the blue state, we're in a blue district, but it's very close. And every time you make one of these really radical kinds of comments, it doesn't help me in my reelection. So I'm going to come back and talk about, first of all, what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, then what one of the aides associated with the Blue Dog Coalition said, and then the reason why Nancy Pelosi finally said, you know what? I'm going to have to step in here. This is just getting out of hand. And so she said, this is the last time we're going to talk about it. I'd like to believe it, but I doubt it. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I recently saw an op-ed co-authored by Tucker Carlson with the arresting title, Woke Fascism.
I wanted to read the author's perspective since I wrote a commentary back in February with the title Woke Politics. All of us have noticed a number of candidates that were forced to apologize for something. The op-ed begins with a question. How do you know if you're living in a free society? Here's a quick test. Are you allowed to say obviously true things in public? In his book, 1984, George Orwell put it this way. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. Mayor Pete has had to apologize for saying that all lives matter. It is true. All lives, black, white, or every race matter. But African-American activists said the statement was offensive. He had to apologize. Kirsten Gillibrand had to apologize for using the phrase illegal alien. She was even forced to read a confession on live television because a few years ago she expressed sympathy for the idea of a closed border. But woke fascism shows up in every venue. Hardly a week goes by when I see some student in grade school or middle school being disciplined for saying that there are only 2 genders. You don't see as many stories about high school or college students because they quickly learn that you should never challenge a teacher or professor about gender identity or sexual orientation. It gets worse. On college campuses and many other venues, you really aren't allowed to even ask legitimate questions about topics ranging from race to immigration to climate change. It's not just the fact that you can't state your opinion. You can't even ask others what evidence they have for their perspective or opinion. This is what it means to live in a world of woke fascism where just speaking the truth can get you in trouble. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes, I want to talk about the back and forth taking place in Congress right now between the Speaker of the House and a couple of members of what is called the Squad. And, of course, the leader of that, at least in terms of the media, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She, interestingly enough, just the other day, essentially in an indirect way, accused Nancy Pelosi of racism. Don't you love this? Because, everybody's a racist. Even the Speaker of the House is a Democrat. Now, again, I'm being somewhat facetious, but again, in one of the interviews she did with the Washington Post, she said, when these comments first started, I kind of thought that she was keeping the progressive flank at more of an arm's distance in order to protect more moderate members, which I understood. That's coming again from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But then you said the persistent singling out, it got to a point where she was just outright disrespectful. Goes on to say this is explicit singling out of newly elected women of color. In other words, the idea is you are disenfranchising, maybe even engaged in some kind of racial bias against those of us who are women of color. So she played the race card against the Speaker of the House. Well, that, of course, led to some reaction, not just from Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, but from an individual, and I think, I don't know the name of the individual, but it doesn't really matter. It's just called a senior Democrat aide with the Blue Dog Coalition, which, again, are some of the few moderates left in Congress. Not many of them, but there are some. Who said, let's not forget the fact that Representative Ocasio-Cortez, chief of staff, called a group of members racist. This is a group of members led by an immigrant woman of color, and this group includes several other people of color, including 2 black men who actually experienced the segregated South. So this back and forth has gotten so bad that Nancy Pelosi actually addressed this issue apparently in a closed-door caucus meeting. and called on Democrats not to take public shots at each other. And that was due to this back and forth that was taking place. So, as we all know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the gift that keeps on giving. But it's also, I think, helpful in the next hour after I've done an interview with Luis Palau, who will be with us at 1 o'clock. I will get into a piece that came out called "The Desire for Fake News Lives in All of Us," and that is the desire for some of us to believe fake news when it's obviously fake news. And yesterday, one of our guests just said in passing that he had heard that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opposed daylight savings time because, quote, she said that an extra hour of sunlight drastically speeds up climate change. Well, first of all, that is a joke. It's called satire. I know a lot of Christians and even some researchers don't get satire. Got that. But that appeared in the NPC Daily a while back. As a matter of fact, I think that's pretty dated if I remember right. I know it was in March. Yeah, I knew it was back months ago. Wasn't even sure if it was a year ago. And it's just a joke. I mean, if you read it in the context, it's obviously a joke, as it's talking about, her ecological genius and the fact that some of these clueless conservatives can't see past the barrels of the AR-15s. It's obviously they're just making this up. But, sometimes people will hear that and go, oh, well, she's so dumb. She thinks that because we have daylight savings, it actually gives us an extra hour of sunlight. And as a result, that speeds up climate change. But that is not true. And I thought since it got mentioned yesterday, it was deserved a mention today. And there is nothing to that story, nothing to that alleged quote other than satire. And from time to time, we do enjoy satire around here, whether it's The Onion or for those of us that are Christians, Babylon Bee. We certainly love some of the things that are there. But let me move on. I was on a talk show yesterday, American Family Radio, as a matter of fact, and one of the issues they brought up is something I thought we would talk about today briefly, and that is the head of Black Entertainment Television is an individual by the name of Robert Johnson. Most people call him Bob Johnson, so Robert or Bob. And nevertheless, he has been somebody who has been very supportive of the Democratic Party. He's African-American, started, of course, the African-American Television Network, but he's more of a centrist, more of a Bill Clinton Democrat, more of like those blue dog Democrats I just talked about. And so even though he supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, he has given at least faint praise to Donald Trump. Now, does that mean he's going to go vote for Donald Trump? I don't know. We'll see. He might. But if nothing else, here's the story, because it says America's political establishment is, he says, riven with partisanship that has become very wicked and very mean. That comes again from Robert Johnson, who added that the Democrat Party, he thinks, has become too liberal. Here's his direct quote. He says, "The party, in my opinion, for me personally, has moved too far to the left." And then he says, and for that reason, I don't have a particular candidate, meaning a candidate I'm supporting, in the party at this time. I think at the end of the day, if a Democrat is going to beat Trump, then that person, he or she, will have to move to the center, and you can't wait too long to do it. Now, here's the problem for those that want to move to the center. You have some of the most remarkable and extreme statements being made right now. Then to say that maybe the public's awareness of those statements will fade by this time next year is possible, but there's known as a campaign that will make a point of trying to repeat those once again. And so some of the things that have been said on the stage so far on the Democratic debates, some of the things that are going to be said in the future in order to win primaries, is all great fodder, quite frankly, cannon fodder, to be used by the Trump campaign. So I thought it was kind of interesting to say this. Now, if you say, well, is it possible that a man that's African-American, who has supported Hillary Clinton, he's always supported the Democratic Party, would actually think about voting for Donald Trump? Here's another one of his quotes. He says, quote, "I think the economy is doing great, and it's reaching populations that heretofore had very bad problems in terms of jobs and employments and the opportunities that come with employment. So, again, he goes on to say that African-American unemployment is at its lowest level." And so he says, if nothing else, he says, I give the president a lot of credit for moving the economy in a positive direction that's benefiting a large amount of Americans. He says, I think the tax cuts clearly help stimulate the economy. I think business people have more confidence in the way the economy is going. And I could give you a lot more questions and comments there, but nevertheless, he, of course, talks about the fact that he's not real thrilled with Donald Trump's style. Find me somebody that really thinks that every one of the tweets, and I'm going to get into in just a minute, what was it, 16 tweets that Donald Trump issued within 3 hours the other day? Okay. But sometimes they'll overlook the style if they believe in the substance. So I'm not even making the statement at this point that Robert Johnson would vote for Donald Trump, but he sure has said some nice things about him, and certainly is sort of calling for the Democrat Party to think seriously about whether or not they really want to head down that road. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that another piece that came out today by Mark Davis, been on the program with us before, a fellow talk show host, talked about the fact that, the Women's World Cup, wonderful, back-to-back championships, unbelievable what the women's soccer team has done, but it's been so overshadowed by the captain. And again, I'll just read one of his paragraphs. He said, instead of, after a week of swallowing team captain Megan Rapinoe's foul-mouthed hostility towards the President of the United States, with less profane echoes in teammates' interviews, we were treated to a master class in how to alienate millions of potential fans in the nation they supposedly represent. And, of course, she's been on a little bit of a tour right now doing interviews and all the rest. One of the posts I saw the other day is where she said, I think we need to listen more and talk less. And somebody posted, starting with you, Megan, why don't you talk a whole lot less? And so the point that Mark Davis is making is it's very obvious that the women are not going to go to the Trump White House, and others have not as well. You can think of the Golden State Warriors and others. And he says, to be clear, a conservative sports team shunning a Democrat White House would be just as obnoxious. But there is a point in time where once we give somebody a little bit of fame, a little bit of notoriety, then they begin to feel like they have the opportunity, AOC was an example we just used a minute ago, to lecture the rest of us on the evils of America and to say we're going to not attend festivities at the White House simply because we don't like the person that's in the White House. And as I said before, unfortunately, I suspect that will go both ways. There will be a time when, if indeed there is somebody in the White House that is a Democrat that some conservative groups don't like, they won't show up either. And I think we have damaged the institution by the people sometimes that are in the institution, but also by the people that don't at least honor the institution even if they disagree with the person that's in that institution. But that's a conversation for another day. Just thought I would surface that. We come back. What about this citizenship question on the census? And what questions do you really have to answer on the census? I think it'll surprise you. We'll talk about that right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute. And if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Looked at a couple of different issues. Let me just mention that in about a half an hour, we will have evangelist Luis Palau with us. And he has been fighting cancer and yet has been able to join us, it looks like, this time. Last time he had to cancel because he wasn't doing so well. This memoir of Luis Palau, A Life on Fire, is something we'll talk about for about a half an hour. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. And then I might just mention in the third hour, that would be 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, Kat Armstrong will be in studio with us. No more holding back. She and her husband are there at Dallas Bible Church. Her husband, Aaron, is the pastor there, and she is just an incredible communicator. I thought you would really enjoy her book. It is certainly aimed at women, but this is one of those books where, okay, the primary target is women, but we men can learn some very important lessons about our own lives. But more importantly, since we have women in our lives, that might be your wife, might be your sister, might be your daughter, might be your mother, whatever it might be, I think you'll want to apply some of these principles as well. So I think it'll be just a great couple of hours, and we are encouraging you to stay with us as long as you possibly can. But let me just for a few minutes get into a couple of the issues that are in the news to give you some perspective that you might need. And one of those is this issue of whether or not there should be a question dealing with the citizenship on the census. Now, back in May, I wrote a commentary, a Viewpoints commentary. By the way, my Viewpoints commentary today is called Woke Fascism. You're welcome to print it out. I'll get to it a little bit later if I can, maybe in the national hour, talking about some of the things that are happening in that regard. But I pointed out that the Supreme Court at that time was considering a case as to whether or not a citizenship question could be on the census. It used to be on. It was taken off by Barack Obama. Donald Trump wanted to put it on, and that made it controversial. Really? And it's a good example of where, in many cases, as I pointed out in the commentary, Congress gave power to the president. And as long as we liked the president, nobody had any problem with it. But as soon as that president became Donald Trump, well, then that can't possibly be used. And we saw that, for example, with the travel ban. That power has been given to the president. It was used by Barack Obama. But as soon as Donald Trump used it, well, okay, that's not fair. Then it certainly, in terms of using the National Emergency Declaration to build the wall, various emergency declarations have been given by the last 6 presidents, and yet it wasn't controversial until, well, Donald Trump wanted to use it, in this case, to build a wall. And then, of course, this one, Congress decades ago gave to the Secretary of Commerce the power to determine the form and content of the census. So when the Secretary of Commerce under Barack Obama said, we don't really need to ask this question about citizenship, well, they pulled it off. Now when they want to put it on, oh, well, they can't be that. And so as a result, that led to, of course, what should have been a pretty simple decision. Forget about for the moment whether you think it's a good idea to ask a question or not. There's been a good argument made that it would be a bad idea because people that are here illegally wouldn't want to answer the census if they knew a question was asked about whether or not they're citizens. So it could affect big states like Texas, California, and others that have quite a large population of people that are not citizens. It would affect them in terms of congressional representation. It would affect them in terms of the Electoral College. It could affect them in terms of even the kind of federal grants they receive. So the point I'm making is not whether it's a good or bad question. The question is, did Congress give the power to the Secretary of Commerce the right to make that decision? Yes, they did. End of discussion. Should have been 9-0. I knew at least would be 5-4. But unfortunately, it went 5-4 the other way because, as I've said on more than one occasion, the Constitution is whatever John Roberts thinks it is on any given day, and he sided with the liberals, and that was that. But Judge Andrew Napolitano raised this question: should we really legally and constitutionally be asking any of those questions? I'll just jump to his third paragraph in which he says the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment constitutionally limit the only question that the census may ask, and that is the only question that the census must answer, and that is how many people reside in a recipient's dwelling. Yet that constitutional question was not good enough for the bureaucrats. In addition to asking about bedrooms and toilets and education, this year the census folks were instructed by President Donald Trump to ask a citizenship status of all people. The Supreme Court ruled on the justification offered by the Commerce Department the question may not be asked. And the point he's making is that when you think about it, almost all of the questions that we have on the census, you really shouldn't have to answer. And it is going to be a big issue if I'm broadcasting here in about January of next year, which I assume that I will be unless something happens. I will get, as we always do when this happens, questions about, do I have to fill out the census? Because some people get the full form where they ask all sorts of questions. Others just get the short form. But he goes on, Judge Napolitano goes on to say that even though the Constitution only mandates and only permits one question, how many persons live here, federal law, in defiance of the Constitution, permits ancillary questions if the answers to those questions will assist the mission of the Census Bureau or the broader federal government. And so the point he's making is that some of these lawsuits really are trying to prevent the idea of putting the the citizenship question on the census. But the bigger question should be whether we should even have those questions there at all. So the biggest issue now that is surfaced is the Justice Department has a set of lawyers that Donald Trump are going to use to try to force through this idea of asking a citizenship question on the census. But then since some of those lawyers were removed, or I think there's good evidence that maybe they just resigned from the case, the Justice Department, as he said, is in a pickle because the judges are always skeptical when lawyers, particular government lawyers who needn't worry about collecting a fee from a client, are replaced during a case with no rational explanation. So again, this is going to, I think, in the long run, pretty much end the possibility that a citizenship question will be asked on the census. And again, one more comment from Judge Napolitano. Does the census count only citizens and lawful resident non-citizens, or all persons? It counts all persons. Thus, citizenship is irrelevant to its counting mission and to the government's enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, as non-citizens cannot vote. Can the president rectify this with an executive order? Judge Napolitano says, in a word, no. The judicial injunctions against asking the question would apply to and supersede any executive order. That doesn't necessarily mean that question may not end up on the final census, but right now it's hard to see how it would, and that's probably enough to cover that issue. Just before we take a break, let me mention real quickly this idea of corporations. Dr. Merrill Matthews was sitting in this chair yesterday, did a very good job, and when he was last with us on a Friday roundtable, lamented, and I knew he was going to have a column coming out on this, that some of these Democratic candidates have been criticizing corporations. Senator Elizabeth Warren said, so we've had an industrial policy in the United States for decades now, and it's basically been let giant corporations do whatever they want. Giant corporations have exactly one loyalty, and that is to profits. Beto O'Rourke, right now we have a system that favors those who can pay for access and outcomes. That's how you explain an economy that is rigged to corporations and the very wealthiest. And then New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, for all the American citizens out there who feel you're falling behind or feel the American dream is not working for you, the immigrants didn't do that to you, the big corporations did that to you. But as Dr. Merrill Matthews points out, there are a lot of people that say, I kind of like these corporations. The largest employer in the United States is Walmart, 2.3 million people. And again, he says sometimes people say that Walmart is on the low end of the pay scale, but he says it's nevertheless been a godsend to small communities where jobs are often scarce and prices are high. Let's take another one. Amazon, 566,000 employees worldwide, and is listed as the most attractive U.S. company to work for, provides a range of jobs from blue-collar to executive, pays very well, with excellent benefits. And Dr. Matthews says, I know people who thought their shot at the American dream had arrived when they were offered a blue-collar job at Amazon. Then he goes through and talks about Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, all those. Then he takes one more since we're running out of time. FedEx, 336,000 employees. UPS, 335,000 employees are listed among the largest U.S. employers. Both provide thousands of high-paying jobs for blue-collar workers who can't or don't want to be office dwellers. And he also mentions ExxonMobil, 71,000 people. And again, just one of the highest-paying employers out there. I think some people are going to say, I kind of like the corporation I work for. I'm not sure I agree with what the Democrats just said. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I've been postponing it long enough, but okay, let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein for just a minute. A parental advisory. I'll try to be real careful because we're talking about somebody that was soliciting underage girls, and it got so bad that even Donald Trump kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago, so I just smile sometimes when they try to tie Jeffrey Epstein to Donald Trump. But the issue has surfaced in part because the argument is being made that the current Secretary of Labor, and again, it's hard to make this thing work outside of the Beltway because inside the Beltway, everybody kind of knows who the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor is, who the Agricultural Secretary is. I think most people might know who the State Department is, but, you know, in most cases, they don't. And you ask 100 people out there on the street today who's the labor secretary, they might now be able to say Alex Acosta only because his name has been in the news a lot. But otherwise, you'd go, I don't even know who this guy is. But the bottom line is that he serves right at the moment as the labor secretary. But the argument is being made, and I think it's compelling, so I'm not disagreeing with it, but I'm going to try to give it some context at least, is that when he was actually involved in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida, that under his leadership, they sort of bent over backwards in terms of addressing the crimes of accused child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, of course, he was already accused of soliciting underage girls. He is, of course, now accused of also sex trafficking as well. We'll get into that in just a minute. But the argument is that by certain kinds of pressure brought, that indeed they allowed Jeffrey Epstein to plead guilty to a state-level charge rather than a federal one, which means that he served about a year in a county jail instead of even in a state prison. So as a result, when you serve in that kind of context, he was allowed to leave on a work release. So the issue right now is Mr. Trump, Mr. President, you have a person working in your cabinet who went easy on Jeffrey Epstein, who you know. Well, yeah, but again, there is something that always keeps getting missed in all of this. Jeffrey Epstein and a few others I'm going to mention in just a minute have been major Democrat donors, and we can now document that Bill Clinton was on many of those trips when they went to that island with these underage girls, and who knows what else will begin to surface as well, which may explain why Donald Trump may have set the record, at least for the Oval Office, on the most number of tweets in a 3-hour period. I heard some people say 16. I don't think I've put out 16 tweets in a month, but no, that's neither here nor there. And I think a part of it is what Yahoo News is saying is he began a multi-tweet rant on a host of unrelated subjects, perhaps to try to push away some of the controversy involving the labor secretary. And some of the tweets were worth mentioning, one of which is a news conference in which they had a social media summit where they were claiming and documenting the amount of censorship on Twitter and Facebook. And if you are already on our mailing list, this booklet that I have right here on social media goes into that in some detail. Another one of the tweets had to do with adding the citizenship question to the census, which we just talked about a minute ago. And so, if nothing else, just one tweet after another. And it is, I think, reasonable to ask, you are the President of the United States. You do probably have meetings with your National Security Council. You probably have all sorts of people coming in and out of your office. When do you even find time to send out all those tweets? And so, of course, that is an issue for another day, but it's just an illustration, again, that there's just a lot of controversy surrounding right now the labor secretary. But while you listen to those particular comments and watch them on television, maybe read them in your newspaper, let's put that in some kind of context, because Michelle Malkin yesterday put out a piece. It appears in various newspapers, Creator Syndicate. It's called Epstein, Bean, and Buck, the Democratic Donor Sex Creep Club. And you can see why I'm being real careful, even the kind of words I use here, because she points out that, of course, Jeffrey Epstein has given enormous amounts of money to Democrats. I think when I was seeing the other day, the amount of money that Chuck Schumer, for example, received. But they're not the only ones. And she talks about, for example, one of the donors, Terry Bean, who has been kind of a deep-pocketed left-wing White House donor, and also has been involved in a variety of different things. He's a prominent gay rights activist who co-founded the Human Rights Campaign organization. But like Jeffrey Epstein, he has something for young minors, but these would be young boys in this case. And a grand jury charged him with, and I won't even get into all the details, about a sexual abuse allegation involving multiple victims, including a 15-year-old boy. So there's one of those other very prominent Democrat donors. Let me move on to Ed Buck. That name might be a little more familiar because he's been a very significant friend of the Clinton family as well. And also another gay rights leader and individual from West Hollywood. And again, all sorts of allegations, all sorts of various things that have surfaced there, including 2 overdose deaths of black men he allegedly paid for sex and drugs. And so the list goes on of the kind of individuals who have been receiving those funds. Many of those, especially when you're talking about California, involve the previous governor, the current governor, the Los Angeles mayor, the Los Angeles district attorney, and on and on. You can read the article. I am not going to, but I just wanted you to say and understand and wanted you to understand that these issues that are being brought up right now, first of all, have been known since 2006 and 2007. Now, of course, it has even more intensity in terms of this issue of sexual trafficking, and more importantly, has much more to do with what has been part of the Democrat Party than the Republican Party or even Donald Trump. But you wouldn't know that by watching the news. So again, I would encourage you, as you watch television, as you read the newspaper, as you listen to radio, including even this program, have your baloney detector on and make sure that you have some level of discernment, because that's going to be, I think, very important as well. Let's take a break. Let me just mention real quickly, my commentary today is called Woke Fascism. That was the title of a piece that was written by Tucker Carlson and another co-author. Since I, a while back, wrote a piece called Woke Politics, I was fascinated by it because he asks a very good question. How do you know if you're living in a free society? Here's a quick test. Are you allowed to say obviously true things in public? In his book, 1984, George Orwell put it this way: freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. And he points out how in these campaigns, whether it's Mayor Pete, Christian Gillibrand, or some of the other examples he uses, they cannot even use accurate terms. They cannot even say things that are true if it's politically incorrect. And I go on to say, well, it's a lot more than that. It's what's happening in the schools, even in the grade schools and the middle schools. It happens in the college campuses, although not as much, because oftentimes students, by the time they get there, recognize you probably don't want to challenge a professor on issues ranging from, say, sexual orientation or gender identity. You also aren't even sometimes allowed to ask legitimate questions about race, about gender, about immigration, even about climate change. And so it illustrates, again, what they refer to as woke fascism. Commentary is available on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you can download it. Of course, you can sign up to receive it every single day. We send one to your inbox. And while you're there, you might click on the button that says Join the Team. If you can help us out financially and join the Truth Team, we'd appreciate it. We're going to be talking with Luis Palau in just a few minutes, right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Certainly, I want to thank those that sat in for me while I was out for a day or two, and that is Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. I'm back here, and it was great to meet some of our donors and some of our listeners at American Family Radio and other stations, including our friends at Birmingham and a variety of others, and I'll talk more about that later. But I want to get right to our interview, because we have a real distinct privilege today to spend some time talking briefly with Luis Palau, the evangelist. For those of you that are younger, you may not know him, but for anybody that has been familiar with his ministry over these many years, of course, there are some that have wondered how he was doing. And so there is this new book out called Palau, A Life on Fire, a spiritual memoir of Luis Palau. We have a link to his website. Of course, it's a hardback book, about 200-plus pages, published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. The endorsements on the back are from President Bill Clinton, President George W. Bush, the late Billy Graham in a previous one, Rick Warren, Tony Evans, and the list goes on and on. Luis Palau, it is just a distinct privilege to have you on Point of View with us today.
Yes, hello, Kerby. Thank you for having me on. When you were announcing all the subjects you touch on, I think when I met you, I think you were studying at seminary, weren't you? I bet you never dreamt that God would use you in such an enormous way across the country when you were young, anyway.
Well, I didn't certainly see that, and now having read your book, I'm amazed as well. Growing up, I learned a little bit more about how when your father died and, the difficulty your mother struggled with and a variety of other things. And, of course, I've followed you since the days at Multnomah School of the Bible. But before we get too much further, Luis Palau, first of all, when I say I'm going to do an interview with you, people always say, okay, how is he doing? Because I think a lot of us had seen the video with you and your sons about your cancer. So how are you doing right now?
Well, it's amazing. They thought that by last Christmas, here it is July or whatever, by last Christmas, they thought I'd be in heaven already. Even my doctors who don't know the Lord, which is most of them, I keep telling them, I'm ready to go, And so here we are, many months later. I'm feeling very well. I know I have cancer. If somebody hadn't told me, I would have known it. I feel so well. God has been so good. The treatment has been rough at times, chemotherapy, the way they did it was pretty rough. Then they lowered the power of it, and they have other angles, other approaches. And I'm feeling quite energetic for somebody with a stage 4 lung cancer. So I praise God and all the people who prayed and people like you who encouraged me along the way.
Well, again, we certainly appreciate the work that you've done. But let's talk about that, because you grew up in pretty much a Catholic culture, but I did not know as much about your mother and getting involved in the Brethren Church. I did know, of course, you went to Multnomah School of the Bible, but for just a minute, give us some of your background, because most of us know you as this evangelist that has traveled the world and spoken to so many individuals and led so many individuals to Jesus Christ.
Well, praise God for that. Ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to honor, Kerby, the missionaries who brought us the Bible and brought us Jesus Christ. I mean, nobody's made a movie on them. Most of them nobody ever knows by name. No books were written, except for Billy Graham in the book that I wrote. All the others are quite unknown, maybe Ray Stedman and Major Ian Thomas. Some people know. But the fact is that these servants of God came to South America in days when it wasn't easy to bring the gospel. brought the Bible, brought Jesus Christ, and nothing else. And I just thank God for them. And I want to honor every missionary because, you know, Kerby, you're so well informed and well traveled. The whole world, there's millions and millions of people who know Jesus Christ, have eternal life. They know they're going to heaven. They're children of God. Why? Because some humble men and women came, some of them single, some of them married, came and brought us the gospel. And we love them. I just love them because they brought us only Christ. So my mom was the first one to come to faith. She was the organist at the local parish church, and she was always searching for peace with God. And then when this Mr. Rogers and Mrs. Rogers befriended my mother, who was just married, she began to read the New Testament. She came to the verse in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." My mom said she was on her knees reading the Bible, the first Bible she ever had, crying and saying, "I'll never see God because I don't have a pure heart." And then the Holy Spirit spoke to her, remembering the verse in communion where the scripture says, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." And she found peace with God on her knees the first time she read the Bible for herself. And then my dad, about a year later, he came to Christ. He was only 24. They were just married. He was a young businessman and very successful, very blessed of God. And they love Christ. They live for Christ. And the missionary said later on, Mr. Rogers said, when Luis Palau, that's my dad, came to Christ, the first thing that was converted was his wallet. And apparently he was generous and he gave money away and so on and so on. Anyway, so that's the early stages of our family coming to peace with God, assurance of forgiveness, assurance of eternal life. That's the beginning of it.
Sure. Let's see if we can talk about the legacy that you've already left. I mean, we sometimes talk about platform evangelism or mass evangelism when Greg Laurie's in studio. But have you ever done any kind of analysis on the number of people on all these different continents that have heard the gospel from your preaching?
Well, you know, we used to keep more statistics when we were young, and then we got so taken up with the mission of carrying on and on and on, and we stopped looking back. But one of our goals was to preach the good news to as many people as possible, to see as many people as possible come to be converted to Christ and have the assurance of eternal life, and then to plant as many local churches as we could. Because among the good things these missionaries taught us was the local church is the only institution that Jesus Christ left on the planet. Everything else should revolve around the local church. And so, well, you know, we have, because of radio and television, 60 years of pounding away on and on and on. Some of the statistics are heavy and it seems like a lot, but when you think that there are 7.5 billion people
That's right.
on the earth today, and in 60 years, every day 155,000 people die, according to CIA statistics, and every day about 300,000 the population grows. So although it sounds like a lot, you still have so many to go. But they say around 1 billion people, we estimate grossly, we've been able to hear the gospel in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, which is probably the hardest continent on the earth.
Yes.
So, and then of the people who've gone to surrender to Christ, we have estimated until about 30 years ago, we stopped adding. We didn't have time to go around studying, but we had about 6,000 congregations that we had kept tabs on that was started because of our campaign evangelism, which we call festivals nowadays.
Sure.
So about 6,000, that gives me great joy.
That's great. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about some of those festivals. I want to talk about your sons and some of the impact of the Palau team. We've got a picture of it in the book as well, Palau, A Life on Fire. It is published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link on our website as well and a link to his website. We'll talk more about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I recently saw an op-ed co-authored by Tucker Carlson with the arresting title, Woke Fascism. I wanted to read the author's perspective since I wrote a commentary back in February with the title Woke Politics. All of us have noticed a number of candidates that were forced to apologize for something. The op-ed begins with a question. How do you know if you're living in a free society? Here's a quick test. Are you allowed to say obviously true things in public? In his book, 1984, George Orwell put it this way. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. Mayor Pete has had to apologize for saying that all lives matter. It is true. All lives, black, white, or every race matter. But African-American activists said the statement was offensive. He had to apologize. Kirsten Gillibrand had to apologize for using the phrase illegal alien. She was even forced to read a confession on live television because a few years ago she expressed sympathy for the idea of a closed border. But woke fascism shows up in every venue. Hardly a week goes by when I see some student in grade school or middle school being disciplined for saying that there are only 2 genders. You don't see as many stories about high school or college students because they quickly learn that you should never challenge a teacher or professor about gender identity or sexual orientation. It gets worse. On college campuses and many other venues, you really aren't allowed to even ask legitimate questions about topics ranging from race to immigration to climate change. It's not just the fact that you can't state your opinion. You can't even ask others what evidence they have for their perspective or opinion. This is what it means to live in a world of woke fascism where just speaking the truth can get you in trouble. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to talk with Luis Palau for just a few more minutes, and we'll get into some of the issues in the news. Got a lot to cover, and we will do so in just a few minutes, but we are still privileged to have with him for a few more minutes the book entitled Palau, A Life on Fire. And if you're not familiar with him, this would be a book that I think would really encourage you. For those of us that have known him for literally decades, 50 years worth of ministry, I learned all sorts of new things as well. But let's talk about the team for just a minute, because anything worth doing really requires a team. The Christian model for ministry is a team, you say. And you have your son, Andrew Palau, as the evangelist, Kevin Palau as the president. For some of our millennial listeners, they might know them more than they know you because they've shown up in some of these festivals. But talk about your family and the team. And in the book, you even have a picture of your team up there in Oregon, because it's just helpful to understand that anything that's worth doing requires a team behind you. True?
Isn't that the truth? When Jesus Christ began his ministry on the earth, first thing he did, he gathered 12 men around him to work together, and one of them became a traitor, but the others were loyal and faithful within their weakness. St. Paul in Acts chapter 20 mentions 7 people that traveled with him. It was an international team from various nations. So if you don't work together with a team, you're a very lonely person, and you really can't achieve much. If Jesus needed a team, and St. Paul did, you and I need it, And when I was listening to your introduction of that book that you were promoting a few seconds ago, I was thinking, evangelism is social action, because evangelism changes people. And the problems of the world are created by us human beings, isn't it? I mean, now I'm preaching now, but yes, a team that actually believes that Christ changes people, changes their behavior, and therefore their attitudes, and they become salt and light, salt that preserves from corruption, light that makes the darkness and ignorance flee. I think it's very exciting. So I get very excited when people ask me, what do you do for, social action? I do many things, and we help the poor, orphans, and so on. But the gospel itself changes people, and you know it only too well, of course, Kerby. But that to me is exciting, and a team helps you to achieve that.
Well, and one of the things that I've appreciated about you is reaching out to the Latin American world. Matter of fact, some of our listeners are aware that not only have I published a series of books, but now just two of my books just recently went into Spanish because my publisher, which right now is located in Argentina, so you'll appreciate that, said we need these kinds of books in Spanish. And reaching out to the Latin American world has always been a very important part of what you do, not to mention the fact you go to Madrid, Spain. Of course, you do various festivals, even in the United States, but that is a very important mission field, isn't it?
Oh, well, absolutely. And you probably have traveled there yourself. But, in Latin America, there's been a lot of poverty. And yet you notice a change, Kerby. When people receive Christ, they suddenly begin to drop gambling, drunkenness, womanizing for the men. They begin to work with discipline. They want their children educated. They begin to clean up their house, paint their house. The change is quick. It's social. It's economic. It's family. It's enormous. And Latin America has needed it badly. When I was a kid, and a student, high school and college, I used to think, why can't we have a country like the USA or like England where justice under the law and freedom under the law exists? Why can't we have it in Latin America? And at first I thought, Kerby, that we would change it from the top down. So we did a lot of meetings with presidents and military dictators and so on. And then we realized when we studied history that actually change comes from the bottom up.
Yes.
It's thousands and millions of people whose lives are changed, and they put the pressure on the authorities to change society. They want justice. They want a lack of bribery and people living up to their word. Anyway, you and I agree on this, of course. But, in Latin America, you see it visibly with your own eyes. And I'm glad that some of your books are in Spanish because it is needed to think clearly about how Christianity blesses and affects society.
Help us for just a minute on this area of evangelism. We do focus on that quite often here at Point of View. As a matter of fact, our latest Outlook magazine that's just about ready to go out has chapters and sections on evangelism. I think there are a lot of people, Luis, that say, well, you're an evangelist, you're gifted in that way, and you're doing these open-air festivals and mass evangelism and platform evangelism, but what can I do? Can you give us some ideas on how we can even just reach our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers with the gospel?
Oh, man, I tell you, Kerby, the first thing you can do is whenever anybody says, my mother is sick, or my husband's in the hospital, or my children, had an accident, the first thing you can do to get a conversation going, and it's amazing how God uses, is to say, could I pray for you? Or could I pray for your mother or your husband or your children? And I have never been turned down, even by atheists and communists have never turned me down when I've said to them, can I pray about this for you? And so that's one thing that you can do. When there's a death in the family, you can also say, I know where I'm going when I die. Do you have that assurance? And can I pray for you? You mentioned that I've been having this battle with cancer. My two doctors, the oncologist is a woman who become a good friend. Our regular, primary care doctor is a fabulous guy. He's become our friend. They don't know Jesus yet, but I talk to them openly when we talk about death and disease and illness and so on, and the assurance of heaven. Most people, even people who claim to be atheists, when they're coming at the end of their life, it's a great opportunity to just humbly but clearly say, well, I am so glad that I know where I'm going when I die. And that always gets a conversation going. Then if people are having troubles with addictions, often they're very open when you say, if it's a fact, St. Andrew, for instance, who has a gift of evangelism. But, my mother won many people to Christ. She's in heaven now. But she would do it not by preaching, but over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and talk to people. And she just talked about Jesus Christ, what he done for her, and how her life was changed. And therefore, you can get a conversation going by just being humbly honest and asking if you can pray or do you know the assurance of eternal life. And if you have an addiction, Jesus Christ has liberated tons of people from drunkenness and drug addiction and sexual addictions. And it's all true. And don't forget, I'm hurrying here because your time is short, don't forget that the Holy Spirit of God uses you and that he was there before you arrived. So we are supposed to give good news. He is the one who gives the bad news. You know, in John 14 it says, or is it 16? No, 14. He will convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. The Holy Spirit makes a person feel their spiritual need and their guilt and their need of forgiveness. So don't panic. He was there before you. You just tell them the good news of what he's done for you, and you'll be amazed how the doors open up.
Outstanding. Again, we have a link to palau.org. It's P-A-L-A-U. Don't even have to know how to spell it because it's on our website, pointofview.net. We have a link to the book, and it's available in hardcover, but also in Kindle. And Luis Palau, as we're saying goodbye, let me just mention that you have a section there on resources, which would be helpful in terms of evangelism, a section on news so they can find out if they might have a festival nearby, and a place where people can give to advance the ministry that you've been involved with for 5 decades. It's just amazing. And so, if nothing else, we wanted to highlight the book, highlight your ministry. For many of us, we followed your career for years. For some of our younger listeners, they may know your sons better than they know you. But if nothing else, it's just great to spend a few minutes with you today. And again, the book is entitled Palau, A Life on Fire. So thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. May God bless you and the Pro Ministries and all the ministry that you've had. Keep at it. We need you. God bless you, man.
Thank you. Well, that's Luis Palau. When we come back, we're going to get into some issues in the news. We have quite a few, and we'll do our best to try to make some sense out of that. But I did want you to know a little bit more about Luis Palau, to pray for him, and as he is going through this cancer treatment and all the things that have been a challenge for him, I hope that you will remember him in your prayers and also find out more about this ongoing ministry that he is doing with his 2 sons and other people on his staff. But when we get back, we'll get into some of the back and forth between the Speaker of the House and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, some things about false news and fake news and those kinds of issues, and a couple other topics that we will get into. Might just mention that a little bit later we'll be talking in studio with Kat Armstrong about her new book, No More Holding Back, which is a book that I think would really minister to you women. But men, we can listen in as well. First of all, there are a lot of things she says that apply to us as well. And second of all, you probably have women in your life. You probably have a wife or a sister or a mother, daughter, some others, and so I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. But first, we're going to get back into the news. There have been some real issues and controversial topics we'll try to get into, and all of that is posted on our website, pointofview.net. So we'll come back and start our way into some of those issues right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Okay, let's get back into the news. And by the way, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Love to get your comments as we talk about some of these important issues. And that is something that we certainly wanted to provide for you, a commentary, as well as an opportunity for you to comment as well. Let me just mention that when we look at the economy for just a minute, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached a record high. And it's worth mentioning, at least from time to time. We don't talk about economics all the time, but it is, of course, going to be relevant in a minute when we talk about the presidential election, congressional elections, and also just your own well-being. If you are able to live a little bit more comfortably, if the investments that you have made or the investments your company has made through your 401k or whatever are doing better, that's also very good. But again, the 30 stock average broke over 27,000 points for the first time in its history, rising almost 200 points today. The S&P 500 rose to trade back above 3,000, while the NASDAQ went up as well, and the S&P 500 broke above 3,000 on Wednesday. So there are just a number of things that have been happening in a positive way in terms of the stock market. Now, I want to come back and talk about how that has been approached by some of the people in terms of the economy. And the first would be to look at one of the remarkable statements that came from Robert Johnson. Now, if you're not familiar with Robert Johnson, he is an individual that is oftentimes identified as a media mogul or an entrepreneur. He is the individual that established the cable network BET, Black Entertainment Television, and some of the other companies as well. That's just one of many. Now, he is African American. He's a Democrat, has been more of a centrist Democrat. That's going to be relevant in just a minute when I talk about some of the back and forth between Nancy Pelosi and some of the comments by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the so-called blue dog Democrats, which I'll get to in just a minute. But let's take first things first. But it was really, I think, striking to me that here Robert Johnson, who is a Democrat, but he's been more of a centrist. He's been more of a supporter of the things that Bill Clinton talked about. But nevertheless, he supported Hillary Clinton in 2016. And if nothing else, it is kind of interesting to hear his comments, because when he was interviewed the other day, he said the party, by that he means the Democratic Party, in my opinion, for me personally, has moved too far to the left. And then he says, for that reason, I don't have a particular candidate. In other words, a candidate he's supporting in the party at this time. He says, I think at the end of the day, if a Democrat's going to beat Trump, then that person, he or she, will have to move to the center, and you can't wait too long to do that. Now, the difficulty with this for the Democrats that want to run against Donald Trump is that right now, if you've watched those debates or even heard about them, this is a country that probably is not ready to move as far to the left as Robert Johnson has been talking about. And so even though he's been a kind of a long-term Democrat and a centrist, he nevertheless has said some very positive things about President Donald Trump. Here's a couple of his quotes real quickly. He says, I think the economy is doing great, and it's reaching populations that heretofore have had bad problems in terms of jobs and employments and the opportunities that come with employment. So he says, so African-American unemployment is at its lowest level. And that's, of course, historically true. He says a little bit later, I give the president a lot of credit for moving the economy in a positive direction that's benefiting a large number of Americans. I think the tax cuts clearly help stimulate the economy. I think business people have more confidence in the way the economy is moving. Now, I don't want to overplay this. It's not like Robert Johnson says, you know what, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't see that happen necessarily, although you just don't know. But if nothing else, here is an individual who, on the one hand, has been critical of the style of leadership of Donald Trump, been concerned with some of the tweets, and I think most people have, and certainly felt that sometimes he's been very divisive. But on the other hand, when he looks at the economy, he's saying, the economy's doing pretty well. It's probably been a great blessing for the African-American community. He, I think, was the first African-American billionaire in America. I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. At least that's what one of the Forbes articles said. So, he's looking at this, also looking at his own portfolio and some other things, and really saying, there are some really strong statements being made right now, really radical, almost divisive statements made by the Democratic candidates, and they're not helping themselves, and they're not going to be able to defeat Donald Trump. Which brings me to a piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews. And again, I want to thank Penna Dexter for sitting in here when I was in Alabama and Mississippi the other day. And then yesterday, Dr. Merrill Matthews here when I was at American Family Radio. And he says that if nothing else, some of the Democrats have said such strong statements against corporations. Let me give you 3 examples. One of the quotes he has here is from Senator Elizabeth Warren. In the debate, she said, "So we've had an industrial policy in the United States for decades now, and it's basically being let giant corporations do whatever they want to do. Giant corporations have exactly one loyalty, and that is to profits." Then you have former Representative Beto O'Rourke. Said, "Right now we have a system that favors those who can pay for access and outcomes. That's how you explain an economy that's rigged to corporations and the very wealthiest." And then, of course, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, also presidential candidate, said, "For all the American citizens out there who feel you're falling behind or feel the American dream is not working for you, the immigrants didn't do that to you. The big corporations did that to you." And so one of the things that Dr. Merrill Matthews points out in his piece is a lot of people tend to say, I kind of like the corporation I'm working for. It's maybe not perfect, and I would maybe wish I made even more, but I really have a job. And, of course, the largest corporation would be Walmart, and that is the largest employer, 2.3 million employees. Now, it does pay on the low end of the pay scale, and sometimes that's one of the criticisms. I understand that from Democrats. But I love Dr. Merrill Matthews' comment. He said, "Nevertheless, Walmart has been a godsend to small communities where jobs are often scarce and prices high." Well, let's jump to a couple of others. One of the top corporations is Amazon, 566,000 employees worldwide, is oftentimes listed as the most attractive U.S. company to work for, provides a range of jobs from blue collar to executive, and pays very well with excellent benefits. And again, he says, "I know people who thought their shot at the American dream had arrived when they were offered a blue-collar job at Amazon." And he goes through Facebook, Apple, let's just pick one more. The transportation companies, if you will, the delivery companies, FedEx, 336,000 employees, UPS, 335,000 employees, are listed among the largest U.S. employers. Both provide thousands of high-paying jobs for blue-collar workers who can't or don't want to be office dwellers. And, he goes through some others, mentions, ExxonMobil, 71,000 people, lots of people getting, in some cases, some of the highest pays. And so when you hear these various candidates, and primarily in the Democratic Party, talking about these evil corporations, I'm thinking there's some people that are working for those corporations saying, I'm kind of glad they gave me a job, and I'm getting paid relatively well, and I've had some great opportunities. And so if you do a Google search, and I've done this before, evil corporations, well, some that show up are ones that you would think you might put in that list, tobacco companies, pesticide companies, something like that. But the best corporations out there in terms of wages, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of the number of people they employ, are ones that most people tend to like. Oh, yes, I know sometimes they criticize Walmart because they don't pay enough, but that's because they provide products at a very low cost. Some people like to go after Apple, and I understand some of that. But I don't think this is going to work very well for a lot of people that say, I know you talk about these evil corporations, and maybe there are some evil corporations out there. I'm not sure I work for one of them, and if what you're going to do is hurt them, I got a feeling it might hurt me. And if they all of a sudden, because you increase the corporate taxes on them even more so, decide to lay people off, I might be one of those people that gets a pink slip. So I'm not so sure I completely resonate with that attempt to bash some of those corporations. And so that brings me back to something we'll talk about after the break. This ongoing debate between the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the squad, as they're called. Those would be the individuals kind of led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's been a back and forth, which caused the Speaker the other day in a closed-door caucus meeting to say, stop criticizing each other in public. And we'll explain why that was necessary to be said and what that might also mean in an upcoming campaign as well. A lot more to cover. I will do so right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Just might mention that we'll have Kat Armstrong in studio with us next hour. No more holding back. But there's been this back and forth between the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the rest of what's called the squad or the group. I mean, there are various phrases that have been used. And it is amazing because this is not something you've seen in the past. Most speakers of the House, even though they have to sort of herd cats and it's difficult to get everybody moving in the right direction, nevertheless can wield a tremendous amount of power. And it's hard to imagine this happening with, for example, Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House when Ronald Reagan was in office, or Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House when Bill Clinton was in office, or even Boehner, for John Boehner and some of the things during George W. Bush, or even Nancy Pelosi when she was there before. Because what we are dealing with here is something unique, and that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of the others have been able to use social media to get a tremendous following. And so instead of being sort of a backbencher, first-year freshman member of Congress, they wield a lot more power. And as a result, the mainstream media have also attracted their attention, and they've attracted their attention back and forth. And so as a result, they do all these interviews. And an interview the other day that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did with the Washington Post, interestingly enough, said, when these comments first started, she means the comments from Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, I kind of thought she was keeping the progressive flank at more of an arm's distance in order to protect our more moderate members, which I understood. But the persistent singling out, it got to the point where it was just outright disrespectful, the explicit singling out of newly elected women of color. And so here, it's almost like she's accusing, not directly, but sort of indirectly, of Nancy Pelosi having kind of a racial issue there and playing the race card. Well, that did not sit well with some of the members of what are called the Blue Dog Democrats. Now, this is the Blue Dog Coalition are primarily individuals would be more kind of moderate Democrats in Congress. And one of the aides said in one of the pieces here the other day, let's not forget that Representative Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff called a group of members racist. This is a group of members led by an immigrant woman of color, and this group includes several other peoples of color, including 2 black men who actually experienced the segregated South. So the pushback has been pretty significant, which is why the Speaker of the House the other day, in a closed-door meeting of the caucus, called on Democrats not to take public shots at one another, and basically today in a press conference said, I'm done talking about all the squad. So you can kind of see some of this playing itself out. And that really kind of relates to one of the pieces that we've posted today on our website by our friend John Smirnick. It's entitled, How Leftists Lie to Themselves. I entitled it Projection, I should say, and Progressives. And that is one of the things you learn about when you talk about in psychology, the Freudian idea of progression is sometimes when they are projecting ideas, these progressives are engaged in projection. That is, they accuse you of something they hold to. And he's got a whole section here in terms of people refer to other people as being intolerant when they tend to be intolerant themselves, accuse other people of racism when they're using racist kinds of ideas sometimes to attack, for example, the white supremacist, white men's books, white history, those kinds of things. It's a fascinating idea, but nevertheless takes this idea, kind of the Freudian idea of projection, and see how a lot of these progressives use projection. And if nothing else, it's a piece that I thought was worth mentioning, and especially surfaces only so well right now with this back and forth with Nancy Pelosi. One of the big battles that's taking place in Congress right now, and also between Congress and the presidency, as well as with the judicial branch, has to do with whether or not we're going to have a citizenship question on the census. Now, the argument should have been pretty straightforward. Decades ago, Congress delegated to the Secretary of Commerce the power to determine the form and content of the census. In the past, we've asked questions about citizenship on the census. Then the Secretary of Commerce under Barack Obama pulled it off. Now they want to put it back on. Judge Andrew Napolitano points out that really this whole question is moot if we look at the Constitution. I know that's a controversial idea, but let's look at the Constitution for just a minute and see if we can apply that. The First Amendment to the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, and the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, he says, actually limit the only question that the census may ask. And the only question the recipient of the census really should answer is how many people reside in your dwelling. Yet that Constitution question was not good enough for the bureaucrats. In addition to asking about, as he said, bedrooms and toilets and education, this year the census folks were instructed by President Donald Trump to ask a citizenship status of all persons. And the Supreme Court ruled on the justification offered by the Commerce Department that the question should not be asked. That's because, he says, even though the Constitution only mandates and only permits one question, how many people live here, federal law, in defiance of the Constitution, permits all sorts of other questions if the answers to those questions will assist the mission of the Census Bureau or the broader federal government. And so he says now, of course, the Justice Department's in a bit of a pickle because there were a number of lawyers in the Justice Department who decided to step down. Maybe they resigned, maybe they were removed. But he says that puts the Justice Department in a pickle because these judges that are going to be looking at this are always skeptical, and lawyers, particularly government lawyers who don't worry about collecting a fee from a client, are replaced during a case with no rational explanation. It's far more likely that those lawyers resign from the cases. But back to the key question, and it's a question I know that next year, when the census comes out in January, some of you are going to ask, do I have to answer all those questions? And he says, interestingly enough, does the census count only citizens or citizens and lawfully resident non-citizens or all persons? And Judge Napolitano says it counts all persons. Thus, citizenship is irrelevant to its counting mission, to the government's enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, which is, of course, the argument that was used by the Commerce Department. Can the president rectify this with an executive order? He says in a word, no. The judicial injunctions against asking the question would apply to and supersede an executive order. So we'll see where this goes, but I think this is just one more argument for why the citizenship question will not be on the census. But the Supreme Court could have simply said, look, this is real simple. Congress gave the Commerce Department the right to construct the census. If indeed the Secretary of Commerce wants to ask the question, he should be able to ask it. Of course, the reason there were lawsuits is this is not just an idle question. If indeed you survey all people rather than just citizens, that's an issue. And if there was a citizenship question on the census, there is a fear that certain individuals who, by the way, are not citizens might not answer the question. That would give you an undercount, especially in states like California or Texas that have a lot of individuals that are not here legally, and that would affect congressional representation. That would affect their participation in the Electoral College, and most importantly, not just power but money, federal allocation of funds. So that's why the court case in the first case, and that's why, of course, you have all sorts of judges and lawyers involved in this case right now. We'll continue to follow it. Tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition with Kelly Shackelford, we'll spend a little bit of time getting into some of the technical details of some of that and help you understand whether or not you're going to have to answer all those questions when somebody comes knocking at your door. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to chat with Kat Armstrong about her new book, No More Holding Back. That coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. And this hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Kat Armstrong in studio. You get to know more about her in just a minute. I think this is going to be really an encouragement to you women to begin to think about how to begin your ministry, how to really expand your ministry, how to develop a ministry heart, and maybe to deal with some of the myths that are keeping you back from being effective. Now, men, we also can listen in, first of all, because we'll find that some of the things that are keeping women from being everything that Christ wants them to be are problems we're dealing with as well. But second of all, if you want to minister to women in your life, that could be your wife, could be your sister, could be your mother, could be your daughter. You're going to want to learn some of these lessons as well. Kat Armstrong is a very innovative ministry leader and sought-after communicator, co-founder and executive director of Polished Ministries. We have a link to the website. We're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes, and that's one that you're going to want to find on your website here at pointofview.net. Her husband, who I'm familiar with, Aaron, is the pastor at Dallas Bible Church, and an individual who's the lead pastor replaced a good friend that we've had in studio with us before. So we've got all sorts of connections. And Kat, first of all, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, I'm delighted. I'm so excited to spend time with you.
This is a book published by Thomas Nelson. People can find it in their local bookstore, but we also have information about what you are providing. And I might just mention that you have a podcast and a variety of others. So a little bit later, we're going to go into everything is available on your website, which is, by the way, very well done. I was very impressed with how you put all that together. And I suspect before it's all through, there are going to be all sorts of people saying, is she available to speak in our church, do a women's retreat? And the answer is what? Yes, of course.
Absolutely.
So we'll talk about that. But let's get into the first section. The book is really divided into three sections. Part one, the messages holding women back. And there are many, but let's take five. Women can't be trusted to learn and lead. You dealt with that even as a student at Dallas Theological Seminary, didn't you?
I sure did. You know, that my whole life I've been encouraged by godly men who have been cheering me on to become all I'm supposed to be in Jesus. But I have had some negative experiences, and one of them happened in a classroom at DTS, and one of my male students piped up after I expressed how fearful I can be about learning about Jesus as a woman. And I know that might sound a little crazy, but the women who are connected to the message in the book, that's really resonating with them. So I raised my hand. I told Dr. Allman, you know what? I'm kind of afraid to learn too much about Jesus. And one of the students in class, he ended up yelling at me and saying, you know what? Women can learn too much about Jesus. And when they learn too much about Jesus, they can hold back the institution of marriage, and they can also hurt the church. And Dr. Allman was incredible. You know, I mean, he came to my rescue and defended my honor and the inclusion of women in seminary classes. But it was definitely a defining moment for me. I think until the student spoke those words to me in that way, I didn't realize that I thought the same thing he did. Mm-hmm. We actually thought the same thing, that women could learn too much. And so I think that there might be a generation of women that have grown up learning about Eve and how she was deceived in the garden and picturing ourselves in the garden, ready to be deceived, wondering, can we be entrusted with a gospel message?
Again, when you think about the history of the church, first of all the women involved around Jesus and all the women involved in one way or another, either directly or ancillary ways with the Apostle Paul and others in missionary. Then you think of all the women missionaries over the years and all the great Bible teachers. My mother had an opportunity to actually sit under the teaching of Mrs. Johnson, which started an organization that you are familiar with in your generation called Bible Fellowship, Bible Study Fellowship. You think, really? I bet that is sometimes a mindset that we have. There are women that have had such a profound impact for the advancement of the gospel. And you even talk about this idea of the Great Commission. The Great Commission is just not for men. We just talked with Luis Palau, and obviously he talks about that.
Yeah.
But the Great Commission applies to women too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I found myself going back to Mark chapter 12, verse 30, looking at this priority Jesus gives for all of Christ's followers. It says to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I started to write out those 4 words: heart, soul, mind, strength. And I noticed that I gravitated towards heart and soul. I think I've been told, maybe through society, maybe internal messages, maybe I've heard it in the church, probably a combination of all of those things, that women are the heart and soul of society. They're our conscience. But I didn't feel as comfortable loving God with my mind and my strength. And then I started to realize, I think I'm gendering the greatest commandment. I think I've made heart and soul women's work and mind and strength men's work. And I need to be all in for Jesus. He's asking me to love him with all, and then to turn around and share that love with all, and to love myself in the same manner. So I'm really trying to undo some of that.
And again, you think of some of the smartest women we've had on this show over the years, both sitting in that chair and others that we've interviewed over the years. And again, there is a place for very smart women. And sometimes when I have smart women, I sit back and just let them talk. But let's get to the other one. I don't have a lot to offer. That's not just a female issue. That's a male issue. I run into all sorts of people, both male and female, that just say, I don't have much to offer. I tell the story, and I guess I could mention it again, in which we were trying to encourage people in the church, and this isn't a Bible church, not yours, but one nearby, where they were encouraging the older men to disciple younger men, and of course older women to disciple younger women. And the chairman of the elder board said, well, I don't think I have much to share with anybody. And I turned to him and said, well, if you don't, we're in a lot of trouble. We all tend to, because of our humility, sometimes think, I don't really have much to offer. And you have a whole chapter on that.
I do. I think that women in particular struggle a lot with this concept, that if we are brokenhearted, maybe we have a troubled soul, maybe we are confused in our minds, maybe we feel weakened in our strength, that then that disqualifies us from participating in the Great Commission and obeying the Great Commandment. And that's not true. It's interesting. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus gives this incredible sermon, with the first and second greatest commandment. And then he moves the same conversation with the same group of people, and he points to a widow. We tell the story of the widow's mite, and she makes a donation, and he says to his disciples, you know what? Her donation was actually more valuable because she gave from a place of poverty, more so than the people who gave from surplus. And so I think he was trying to make a sermon illustration that if we're to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, he then turns and says, you know what? She doesn't have a lot to offer. And that's true discipleship.
Well, again, one other one that I want to get to maybe after the break is the idea of marriage and highest calling of motherhood. And I don't think there's a contradiction at all between being a good mother, a good wife, and a good Bible teacher. You also talk about I'm too much to handle, and leading ladies don't fit a supporting role. So there's just some great material in this book. And let me just mention real quickly that it's called No More Holding Back. Kat Armstrong is with us. We have about 200 pages in here, which is really great material. It's published by Thomas Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. And then some other great notes and resources. And it seems to me when we come back from the break, we might spend a little bit of time talking about how people can use it, because reading through it would be one thing, but I think this would be just a great Bible study, a great small group study. And for some of you that are saying, how am I going to start in the fall here? What might I want to cover? I'm thinking this may be one of the books you might want to consider. So again, we have some great information about Kat Armstrong. If you click on her picture, that will take you to her website, which is entitled katarmstrong.com, and tell you a little bit more about some of the other resources that are available through her, through Polished Ministries. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. So we'll come back, take a break, and get into a few more of those excuses, but then get into developing a heart for ministry, which is a fascinating section in this book, and then talk about some obvious application. All that coming up right after this.
– 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2. – 2
I recently saw an op-ed co-authored by Tucker Carlson with the arresting title Woke Fascism. I wanted to read the author's perspective since I wrote a commentary back in February with the title Woke Politics. All of us have noticed a number of candidates that were forced to apologize for something. The op-ed begins with a question. How do you know if you're living in a free society? Here's a quick test. Are you allowed to say obviously true things in public? In his book, 1984, George Orwell put it this way. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. Mayor Pete has had to apologize for saying that all lives matter. It is true. All lives, black, white, or every race matter. But African-American activists said the statement was offensive. He had to apologize. Kirsten Gillibrand had to apologize for using the phrase illegal alien. She was even forced to read a confession on live television because a few years ago she expressed sympathy for the idea of a closed border. But woke fascism shows up in every venue. Hardly a week goes by when I see some student in grade school or middle school being disciplined for saying that there are only two genders. You don't see as many stories about high school or college students because they quickly learn that you should never challenge a teacher or professor about gender identity or sexual orientation. It gets worse. On college campuses and many other venues, you really aren't allowed to even ask legitimate questions about topics ranging from race to immigration to climate change. It's not just the fact that you can't state your opinion. You can't even ask others what evidence they have for their perspective or opinion. This is what it means to live in a world of woke fascism where just speaking the truth can get you in trouble. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about some of the excuses at the moment that all of us make, but especially in this case, women make, that keep them from really holding back. And this is why the title of the book is No Holding Back. We also have a link to katarmstrong.com and information about Polished Ministries. In just a minute, we'll talk about that. But we talked about women can't be trusted to lead and learn, but also don't have a lot to offer. What about this one? I think it's pretty easy to dismiss, marriage and motherhood. I don't see any contradiction at all between being a good mom, being a good wife, being a good mother, and also being a good Bible teacher. I'm sure you don't either.
I do not. I think they work really well together. But, I think I've heard a lot of messages in the church and then probably from society in general that when you're a Christian woman, the highest goal is to get married. That's going to be your greatest joy. Being a mother is going to be your highest calling. And I don't think we have to devalue the institution of marriage or the incredible role of motherhood for Christian women, while at the same time elevating Jesus to where he's supposed to be. So I would say, I know it's semantics, but I think it's important that we distinguish and we say that the highest calling of any woman is Jesus, right? And the greatest joy will be Jesus. But I think sometimes we have elevated marriage and motherhood for women, specifically in Christian subculture, as kind of the end-all be-all. And now we've got a generation before us where most of the women are single. 30% of women struggle with infertility. So we've got a whole generation that's waiting to get married later in life, choosing to have fewer children. And so what are we telling this next generation? That they're in a holding pattern? That we're waiting for them to get to a place where they can really engage with the great commandment? Of course not. You can love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, irregardless of your age, your stage, your title, your job description, because we know those things change over time. And so what I'm challenging in the book is that we should really elevate Jesus, and not devalue the role of marriage or motherhood.
You said something in passing. I don't want to camp out too long, but again, you have a high percentage of single women. And I remember when we first started having women at the seminary, the first few were pretty much single women that then when they graduated didn't know where to go. One of them joined Probe Ministries and a couple others joined mission groups, because it's like we're still trying to figure out where that fits. Now, again, that dates me for many years to the kind of conversation that no longer probably exists, but it's a good illustration of the fact that the church has always sort of struggled with the idea that, yes, our ideal would be a family, but there are a lot of people that are not in families. They're single or single again. We need to find a place for them as well. But let's talk about a couple others. I'm too much to handle. Leading ladies don't fit in supportive roles. I can put those two together because they kind of come together. They're kind of synergistic, aren't they?
I think there are going to be a lot of female leaders, whether they're in the business place or in ministry, that find themselves saying, am I too much to handle? Am I crossing some unspoken boundary? Am I too strong when it comes to Jesus or my knowledge in the scriptures?
Mm-hmm.
And emphatically, we should be saying, no, of course not. If you're to love God with all of your strength, it will require being strong.
Yes.
And if we're indwelt by the Holy Spirit of God, who exhibits some of his power through strength, then we'll be strong if you're a Christian woman. But I think sometimes we're a little afraid of that. And I think that we haven't been given any favors, maybe in our Christian subculture, about how we can bring the genders together to partner together. Because this isn't about just elevating women. This is about working with our brothers in Christ.
Yes. Well, let's talk about developing a heart for God, because now you've made it clear that it's not an either or, but okay, what about this idea of developing a heart? You had some very good and practical, not to mention biblical ideas about what that means, because developing a whole heart for God, we talk about that, but you give us some ideas about what that really looks like.
I started, Kerby, to look through the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation at the word heart, and how, first century readers would have been understanding the semantics of that word. It's a little bit different than what you and I may think. I think I approached the scriptures and thought the word heart, loving God with all your heart, meant loving him with your emotions, the feely part of you.
That's how we normally think, yeah.
But you know what? In the scriptures, there's a lot more to that word.
Mm-hmm.
It encompasses the very center of our being,
the
things that determines our decision-making process, how we process information, and then it ultimately determines our actions. And so to love God wholeheartedly means that we have to shape our whole lives around the gospel message.
Yes. So the first one, heart, soul, mind, strength. Let's see, we can cover each one. Soul. Again, the soul is the one that gets short shrift sometimes in the scriptures. We just say, well, I pray for your soul, but we don't really think about what that means. What did Jesus mean when he talked about heart and now soul?
Yeah, I tell a funny story in the book about my husband, Aaron, who just does not get music. And I'm a big U2 fan. And so when we were dating, it was kind of an issue. I thought, how in the world am I going to marry this godly man that I'm in love with if he doesn't know Bono's voice over the radio? And I remember asking him at a U2 concert, man, do you have a soul? Like, how do you not know Bono's incredible booming voice? And the joke is that, you know what, we don't just have a soul, we are a living soul.
We are a soul, yes.
And so the word soul from Genesis to Revelation embodies this concept that we need to be all in for Jesus, not just the spiritual side of us, but soul really means life itself. And so if we have lives committed to Jesus, that's when we know we're all in for him.
Well, we've already talked about heart and soul, and like you said, that tends to be the ones we always give to the women. Now let's get into the two that we don't oftentimes. The next one, heart, soul, mind, staying open to new ideas. And also this idea of loving God with your mind, it is really important, because if we're going to be discerning, we need to know how to tear down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. It seems to me that the mind is very important in almost all the epistles that the Apostle Paul writes about. So we should be applying that and teaching that to people in our sphere of influence as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think I tell multiple stories in the book about how there have been so many women over the years. I've been in ministry for 20 years. I've been with Polished for 11.
Yes.
And these millennial women have confided in me over and over. Generation of women that I think are saying, you know what, I want to study a little bit more about the scriptures, but isn't that something reserved for my pastor, for the elders at my church, maybe a deacon or a leader? And of course not. This is for everybody. But in that particular chapter about loving God with all of your mind, I talk about Romans chapter 12 and the concept that the Holy Spirit is constantly renewing our thoughts,
Right.
aligning us to the will of God, to think the way that he does, to view things the way he does. And if that's true, and we know that the sanctification process is ongoing, and that means we have to keep an open mind. And of course, I'm not talking about the tenets of our faith that are in our creeds that determine orthodoxy. I'm talking about how we view the things going on in our culture, keeping an open mind about how we're going to apply these timeless truths to our everyday.
And again, one of the themes that's kind of run through Point of View this year is the issue of discernment, because let's go back to Romans 12. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind in Christ Jesus. Or I just talked about taking every thought captive. Well, in Colossians 2:8, it says, make sure that you aren't taken captive by false philosophy. So it seems to me that it's always been true in the first century, but I think it's even more true in the 21st century with these digital devices, all of the time we spend in front of a screen to really develop discernment. And that's where the Christian mind is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. I am hearing from women all the time that are saying the scriptures are absolutely changing my life. And of course they are. And that's why they need to be in the scriptures every single day, in my opinion, humble opinion.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that a lot of women feel that propensity to the scriptures. And I think if we develop women who love God with all their mind and praise them for knowing a lot about the scriptures, we'll start to see that that's what they want to do.
Yes. Again, heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's important because it's really slaying the forces of darkness. And again, in some respects, we live in a fairly dark culture now, and it's really important that some of those principles that Jesus lays down and Paul and Peter and James lay down in the scriptures in the New Testament really need to be applied today. And we need strong women, don't we?
Absolutely. I remember looking at the armor of God and thinking to myself, I'm actually picturing armoring my husband, Aaron, readying him for a spiritual battle, this cosmic war that's going on around us, and failing to recognize that God has enlisted me to participate as well. I need to put on the armor of God, and when I do so, I will inevitably be strong. I'll be a force to slay darkness, to push back darkness in our world. And so I hope all women really grab onto that message.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, first of all, I encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. And we have a link to katarmstrong.com, although it's a real easy name to spell, so you can go to it yourself. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the material she has there. There's a podcast, there's coaching, there's information about this book. You can order it from her, and I would encourage you to do so. That'll help her ministry. But we also have information about that on our website, so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And we're going to talk about some of the resources that are there. And there is a Bible study, so if you find yourself saying, okay, this would be really good to teach, but I would like to have something so that it would be sort of turnkey. Well, the good news is we've got that as well. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And let's open up the phones. Perhaps already we've talked about something that you have a comment or a question about. That number is 800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join the conversation today, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about Kat Armstrong and maybe even schedule her for speaking, we'll talk about that on her website right after this. Stay tuned. We've got a lot more to cover. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Having a conversation today with Kat Armstrong, and we have her website up right now, KatArmstrong.com. Let's first of all talk about Polished Ministries. 11 years, I think I heard you say?
Yes, I co-founded the organization with
Yes.
Stephanie Giddens. It was her idea, and here we are. We were both seminary students.
Mm-hmm.
We were in grad school, and we were also working full-time, newlyweds. And we were kind of bemoaning the fact that we needed encouragement. And so we started getting together about once a week to pray. And inevitably, we would end up swapping stories about trying to share the gospel in the workplace, which is much different than doing it overseas or through a track, which are incredibly effective ways to share the gospel. But Stephanie and I found that we needed something for us. And we thought, you know what, wouldn't it be great to create a safe space for women who feel disconnected from the local church or maybe feel disillusioned by their faith? How could we invite those women in a conversation about Jesus? And so we co-founded Polished 11 years ago, and here we are.
Well, and again, you are having quite an impact on millennial women and millennials, and we do a millennial roundtable. So can we invite you to come to one of those?
I would be honored.
Well, I'd love to see your interaction with Nick Pitts and some of the other people that we've had on the program here, and Chelsea Human and some others. But again, you have a podcast that's available. There's coaching. There's, of course, the book. And in a minute, I want to talk about what actually goes with the book. So what are some of the other resources that people can find?
The Polish podcast. We have listeners all over the country now that are getting into our podcast. And what I do is I interview a professional woman who loves Jesus already. And we talk about her story, how she came to faith, what it's like to be a woman in her industry. What does her work-life balance look like? We talk about all sorts of things. And it feels like a very casual conversation. But now that Polished is in 7 different places across the country and we're growing extremely rapidly, we'll have 20 chapters by 2020. We've got close to 100 events this year alone. And that means 100 incredible speakers that love Jesus that are in the workforce. So we get to hear their testimony and a little bit about how we can grow spiritually, learning from their experience. So Polished Podcast, everyone needs to check it out. It's a great show. And then I do coaching. I do small group cohort coaching with Tailored Coaching, and they provide an opportunity for aspiring female teachers and preachers to learn the methods that we learned in seminary, how to put together a biblical message. We do it over the course of 6 months, and Kerby, I have to tell you, it is the best lunch break I've ever had, is devoting those 2 hours to these up-and-coming women in the next generation. They are so eager to learn about how they can read the scriptures and then apply it to their own lives and then give messages that change people's lives. And they're so passionate. They're so talented. It's just an honor for me to kind of walk alongside of them and show them how to put together a message.
Well, and again, one of the things that I am so excited about is all the tools that existed or exist now that didn't exist when I was there. You know, now we can go online. I can use my Logos software, and I don't have to know all the Greek because it'll find it for me and pull it all together. You have all those YouTube videos and all sorts of great resources. So we can equip men and women in ways that we never could before. And I know you're having access to that, and especially with a millennial who's usually pretty digitally savvy, they can get benefit from that. But let's talk about something else. Here's the book. But you got to hold up as you talk the manual that goes with it as well. That's the study guide. And so there is a great opportunity for somebody, if they would like to actually do this study in their small group, their Bible fellowship, maybe even teach some of it from the pulpit. What's available?
So in the book, you've got resources at the end of each chapter. You've got discussion questions. So I'm envisioning that maybe some working women may want to huddle up some of their coworkers that they're already praying with, reaching out to, and work through those discussion questions. But for the Christ follower who wants to get into the scriptures themselves, HarperCollins has been so good to me, but they helped me design a 6-week study guide. It's got 3 lessons every week, and we go through so many scriptures talking about the great commandment and being all in for Jesus. And it also has a DVD set with it, if you can believe it. My first time to use a teleprompter was working the DVDs.
Well, again, like you mentioned just a minute ago, you got discussion questions at the end of each one of the chapters. You usually have anywhere from 5 or more questions that immediately are turnkey, because a lot of people say, well, if I have the book, how am I going to figure this out? Well, the questions are already there. But then with this study guide and the DVD, you've got everything. You really do have an opportunity to put together the entire program, and as a result, cover so many different issues, because so far what we've talked about are the kind of the 5 messages holding women back. Then we talked about kind of the 4 about the call to love God. But let's talk about the part 3, that is the call to share God's love. And that, I think, illustrates, again, just this need to take some of these ideas and to apply them, as I say, to give it some shoe leather, right?
Absolutely. In part 3, I have this incredible opportunity to talk a little bit more about Polish and how Stephanie Giddens and I felt a need for ourselves to figure out how we can minister to our coworkers, and as a result took a need that we had and turned it into a platform for ministry. And I am hopeful that there's going to be a generation of women that'll look at what they need and decide not necessarily to complain about it or to leave the church over it, but instead to work hard to make it come to a reality. And so instead of saying, gosh, I'm so disappointed that there's nothing for me at my local church, Stephanie said, why don't we do something? We are best equipped to reach young professional women because we are. Mm-hmm. We know where they go and what they like and where they shop and what they're talking about. And I remember sitting with my friend Valerie, who's now overseas in an undisclosed location, doing incredible ministry work with Muslim women. And I remember her telling me, Kat, you know, God has made you a missionary right where you are. You don't have to learn a new language. You don't have to become debt-free, which many millennials will be so grateful for. And you don't even have to move or find new friends. You could be a missionary right where you are. So in chapter 3, I talk about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength will result in loving others and loving yourself, which I think means applying yourself to your spheres of influence, figuring out who do you have influence over and how you can be sharing the gospel with them.
Yes. You know, we have Diane Pattison on here, 4 Word Women. She talks about professional women. And I think the problem with professional women in general, but let's focus on millennial women, is some of the things I've looked at in terms of even our own surveys that Probe Ministries has done with Barna Research and others. Millennials, it's not like they're against religion. They just don't think about it. There are probably a lot of professional women that you would like to minister to that go, why would I want to study the Bible? And so that's the biggest hurdle, isn't it, for you?
It
right
is,
now?
and that's what's the draw for Polish Ministries. They look at it and they think professional development, networking over a business lunch. This is furthering my education and my profession. I'm going to get some great networking done. So they see all of these benefits. You know what? I need a community of other young professional women, people I can go to yoga with or a happy hour with. And so I'm going to go to Polish. I'm going to find friends. I'm going to find a community. I'm going to find some business contacts. And in the process, we end up sharing the gospel, and they realize, you know what? I miss God. I miss going to church, and this was a part of my life. And so the studies that Barna is producing, that, you know, the statistics are kind of grim, but I like to share with people that now 68% of the workforce are millennials.
That's right.
And so they're a major part of everyday life and business. But not only that, the millennials are more likely to share their faith than any other generation before them. And that's coming straight from Barna. So I think it's an untapped resource. We have this army ready to enlist into God's service if we would just reach out to them where they are.
Yeah, you're singing from our song sheet. That's exactly what we talk about so often. For people that say, okay, I would like to have this in my community, or maybe there's one in my community, I don't know about that. Talk about how they can connect up for your website, because there are some right now that's saying, well, I would love to do this in my group. I would love to do this in my office. Where do I find out if one exists, or how do I get one started?
Sure. You want to go to polishedonline.org. Once you get to the website, you'll get to see all of our 7 cities. And you'll notice that we're about to launch in Muskego, Wisconsin, and Pasadena, California, and Washington, D.C., and all over the nation. So you can check out where we're headed. And then if you don't see your city there, your area, just go ahead and click on the button that says Start a Chapter. It's really simple. We love partnering with innovative ministry leaders and churches to make sure that the gospel gets out to young professional women. So it's designed for women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. But if you're listening and thinking, oh, I wish I had had this when I was in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, we have mentorship opportunities that these women are craving relationships with women who are just a few steps ahead of us.
Well, the scriptures talk about older women discipling younger women, and I found that there are all sorts of millennial women that are looking for mentors. The difficulty is finding the people that want to be a mentor, right? So again, that's something that you can empower them to do and recognize, as I shared just a few minutes ago, sometimes the men have that, but the women do too. What do I have to share? Well, they have quite a bit, and sometimes they don't even realize what that is. So let's take a break, and when we come back, let's open up the phones, give you a chance to ask a question or make a comment if you'd like. 800-351-1212, 351-1212. No More Holding Back is the name of the book. And let me borrow the study guide since people haven't seen that. So there's a study guide as well. So this is a twofer in case of some of you watching online. And that is just a great resource that I think you could find and begin to develop. And if you've been looking for some project that would be good for your church, your Sunday school class, maybe even your office, I would hope that you would take the time to find out a little bit more about Kat Armstrong. And, of course, we have some great material already available at her website today, so we'll go back and talk about some of those resources as well. Again, katarmstrong.com, and, again, Polished Ministries. Let's take a break. We'll come back and take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Kat Armstrong, and again, we're talking about the book, No More Holding Back. And in the last chapter, you talk about letting love in, and it seems to me that's another aspect of this as well, pouring love out, letting love in. Can you kind of explain that? Because it's also very key in terms of the application of all the things we've talked about here.
Yeah, so the book is a journey through the first and second greatest commandment, right? So we talked about loving God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love others. And then this key part of the verse that we like to overlook a little bit, love as yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I asked some of my girlfriends during the writing process, what do you think about self-love? What do you think that means to you? And all of them said, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about self-care. I could talk about self-care all day long, getting a pedicure, taking a long leisurely walk, taking a nap. But when I said, but what does it mean to apply God's love to ourselves? What does that look like? What does selfless love towards self look like? And so I spent a lot of time talking about the verse in Leviticus. So, I mean, nobody really likes to read Leviticus. In girl world, it's like brow maintenance, Kerby. It's something you got to do. It shapes the whole face. But it's not something you want to do. And when you get through Leviticus in that chapter 19, it's buried in there.
Yes.
And yet Jesus lifts this obscure
That's what he
verse
does, yeah.
and says this is
And
the
adds to
second
it.
greatest commandment.
Yes.
So I do a little deep dive into that, talking about how we can let Christ's love into our lives and how I see lots of women rejecting God's love for themselves. And it's a lot easier to love other people with God's love than it is to turn it on ourselves.
Well, and part of that is a cultural thing in that, well, again, anybody that loves themselves, well, that's narcissism, and that's the problem we got right now, and everybody's got selfies and Facebook and things like that.
Yep.
But the scriptures do address that issue, and so sometimes we fail to really apply that principle. So I think it's really good. But you have a section here, where do we go from here? And you even tell a story about Lydia and some others that really you found that there are people that have been held back, and maybe you can share one or two of those stories, because if nothing else, now having done ministry, you recognize this isn't just theoretical. You've had a chance to apply these principles to people that you've ministered to.
Yeah, absolutely. Lydia is one of my girl crushes in the scripture. I didn't see her. Dr. Allman introduced me to her, I think, for the first time in a New Testament course at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I remember thinking, this is such a pivotal moment in my life. I didn't realize that Lydia was the first Christian in the whole continent of Europe. She was the first person to convert. So when Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke journey over on this missionary journey to Philippi for the very first time, they find a group of women. And it's Lydia who's persuaded her friends to rally. And she wasn't a Christ follower. She hadn't heard the gospel. But we know she must have been a God-fearing woman. And I think about what kind of persuasive personality can get your girlfriends to come to a prayer meeting to an unknown God. But she did, and she had a lot of influence in her city. She was a very successful businesswoman, and some of the research I've done, there are theologians and historians that suggest she was probably a single mother by the time Luke and Timothy and Silas and Paul meet her in Philippi. And so we don't know if she was widowed, or we don't know if she was a single mom, but we do know she was exhibiting a lot of independence in a culture where that wasn't the norm. And so I did a lot of study about how influential her business was and how her business influence then lended itself to sharing the gospel with all of her family who got baptized. And then at the end of that part in Acts chapter 16, it's interesting. Paul says, she persuaded us to go back to her home. Mm-hmm. And the word there in the Greek means she wrestled them to get there. And I bet she did, because a lot of businesswomen know what it's like to be intent on what they want to get done. And Lydia ended up being the co-founder of the Philippian church.
That's true.
So when I read the book of Philippians now, and I read Paul's incredible letter that says, I commend you, because we've been in partnership in the gospel since the very beginning. Remember when I was thrown in jail? After he left jail, he went back to Lydia's house before he left Philippi. And so now I read the book of Philippians and I think, oh, there would have been a businesswoman draped in her purple cloth or that purple dye as they unrolled the scroll, because she's one of the co-leaders, one of the founders, one of probably the funders of that particular church. And so I spend the last chapter of No More Holding Back talking about how Lydia loved God with her heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think she gives women today instruction on how we need to be all in for Jesus.
Yes. And we've taken a group over to Greece. And so when you go to Philippi, the ruins are still there. You can figure out the pathway, because the pathway is still there to the river. So you assume that then they were probably either a little bit upstream or downstream right there. And you get the sense, well, there's where most likely your house was. Here's where the Philippian jailer was. These were the people that were the foundation of the church in Philippi. Mm-hmm. And here, obviously, very wealthy, because purple is the evidence of wealth, because it took so much to actually produce just a little bit of purple dye. So it shows that you can be a wealthy woman and actually make a difference for the gospel. And in fact, to be the person that the church was established right there in Philippi.
Yeah, Richard Askoff, one of the theologians I read a lot on Lydia, he talks about how we may not even have the book of Philippians and the church at Philippi if it hadn't been for her innovative and pioneering spirit to accept the gospel and then apply it to her world. And I think a lot of women's lives change when they start to see themselves in the scriptures. For so long, we have read the book of Philippians, assuming an audience maybe only of men or men unrolling the scroll or being in charge. And instead, what the scriptures speak about is this incredible partnership that men and women work together to advance the cause of the gospel, that together we were designed to build the kingdom. And so I think a lot of women embrace Lydia's story and go, wow, I mean, I could be like
You
Lydia.
could do that, yeah. And the first Christian in the European continent. Pretty amazing. Just about out of time. Let's talk about what's available on your website. I know people kind of tune in and tune out a little bit, but there are some action items. First of all, if they would like to do this particular teaching, you again have a study guide. I'm thinking that some churches might say, we'd kind of like to have Kat come and start it by speaking at the church. You're available for speaking and coaching and things of that nature as well, right?
I love teaching the Bible. Love teaching the Bible. Any opportunity I can get in front of women and open the scriptures is truly an honor. So I've got a schedule booked through the fall, but I would love to take more speaking engagements in 2020. And then if you're an aspiring female teacher or preacher and you want to learn the 10-step process of how to put together a Bible message, I would love to help coach and train you to do that.
And again, the podcast is available for everybody. And again, you can actually listen and subscribe. So click on that button as well. And it's kind of a who's who of individuals that you've interviewed, some people that you've not heard about, others that you would like to know about. And that will be a real encouragement. The coaching and a variety of other things as well. But one more time, this book is published by our good friends at Thomas Nelson. And one of the things that they have done is put together not only the book, but the study guide. So what would you recommend in terms of that study guide? Is this a 6-week series? It's an 11-week series since you have 11 chapters. What would you recommend?
I think for the book, you take 11 weeks potentially to read one chapter a week. And then the study guide is a companion. So each lesson in the study guide goes with one of the chapters in the book. So if you're already talking about it at the office or at home or in your church group, this is a great way for women's Bible study groups and churches to take this material and encourage their women to love God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength. So the 6-week session guide, HarperCollins told me they're so good to me, Kerby, but I'm the first one to have the digital downloads of the DVDs. So if you purchase the DVDs, you can also download them online.
Perfect. Yeah.
I think a lot of busy modern women are going to want to listen in the car, not necessarily on their laptop.
Yes. And so, again, that DVD is available. The downloads are available. And, again, HarperCollins, which, of course, is the owner of Thomas Nelson there. You can find it in your local bookstore, but I would encourage you just to simply go to katarmstrong.com. You can get the book there. And it is just a delight to have you in studio. And I'm hoping we can have you back for the Millennial Roundtable and mix it up with everybody talking about how to reach out to this millennial generation.
I would love that, Kerby. Thank you for having me on the show today.
Thank you for being here. One more time, again, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Kat Armstrong with us today. And so if you would like to know a little bit more about her, that is the second hour interview. The first hour, I just might mention, we had Luis Palau. So if you'd like to go back and listen to either of those interviews, you can click on that button that says listen. If you'd like to watch it, click on that button or just simply go to the YouTube channel and you can find it there. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on our Friday Weekend Edition. We'll see you then.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.